All right, good day, everybody. Welcome to our July episode of Calmly Considered. I'm Allan Bevere. I'm the self-appointed Anselm Chair of Podcast, Theology and Culture at Faith Seeking Understanding University, where all seekers are welcome to ponder profound things free of charge. And as always, my conversation partner is the Grand Poobah Chair of Economics and Public Theology here at FSUU, Michael Cruz. Michael, how are you today?
I'm doing fine. How are you, Allan?
I'm doing great. So the topic this morning is what's up with inflation? So we got to spend some time on that. But before we do that, we always have to talk just a little sports.
Yes.
And I don't know, who's more pathetic, the Royals or the Guardians?
Well, I haven't thought the Guardians are still like around 500, aren't they?
Yeah, but you know, that sounds pathetic to me. But what are the Royals right now?
Like 17 games below 500.
Okay, all right. So, you know, the
So we
pudding. Yeah, all right.
But it's been exciting though because of this whole thing with them going to Toronto and 10 players not going because they didn't have their COVID vaccinations.
Right.
So we ended up with a bunch of rookies and had at least 4 or 5 players that made their debut a major league appearance. And they were so fired up. The games were so exciting.
Yeah.
First 2 of the players had their first hits, and their first hits were home runs. And it was just, it's been
cool.
So
it's really cool.
They're not doing so great now, but the future's looking pretty bright. It's kind of fun. So
Good.
yeah.
I was at the last Guardians game I went to. They played the Yankees, and the Guardians were terrible.
Yeah.
What was even worse, we were sitting next to an obnoxious Yankees fan from New York.
Oh boy.
You know, I don't want to stereotype, but you know something, I have been to Cleveland games at home where there's been a lot of Yankees fans come from New York, or when it's the Red Sox, Boston fans, Detroit.
Yep.
You get a lot of these fans in. And I just got to tell you, pound for pound, the Yankees fans are the most obnoxious. I mean, and it isn't just, I'm not talking about cheering when, you know, your guy hits a home run and you cheer. That's part of the game. I'm not talking about that. I'm just talking about obnoxiousness, just being obnoxious. Yes. So if you're a Yankees fan and you want to email me a rebuttal, please feel free. I'm glad to do that. I'm glad to entertain what you have to say, but boy, it was really rough. So anyway, but hey, real quick NFL. Patrick Mahomes did a beer commercial without doing a beer commercial.
I thought that was pretty creative.
That was pretty clever. You think he's actually going to get away with it?
It seems like it so far. I can't imagine that they didn't have a whole room full of attorneys going over everything.
Probably did.
Make sure they got it just right. But it was pretty funny that it was that the Coors Light, which was a flashlight that he was advertising, was for charity. All the money that they got for those flashlights for charity.
Well, that's going to be hard. That's going to be hard for the NFL to get into snit over, I guess.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
So
that was pretty clever. I enjoyed reading about that. And of course, then there's the 3-ring circus known as the Cleveland Browns.
Oh my goodness!
With Deshaun Watson and.
What a disaster.
You know, it's just as I said, the Browns had about 2 years of uncharacteristically great decision making, and now they're back to doing Brownie things again. It's just amazing. So, and anyway, I've gone on record saying that I'm not going to cheer for the team as much as I've been a Browns fan all my life. I don't think we need to be excusing sexual harassment, assault, or whatever you want to call it. And, you know, when 20 plus people accuse you, I'm sorry, it's not a conspiracy.
Yeah, right.
So,
yeah. I agree. That's a tough one. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm not doing it. So if they win the Super Bowl finally once in my life, it'll be without me. Oh, well. Yeah. You know, what can I say? All right. So what's up with inflation? So inflation right now, my understanding is it's 9.1%.
Yeah, somewhere in that range. Yeah.
Right in that range, which is the most since 1981.
Correct.
All right. So let's talk. Well, let's just talk. I mean, what is inflation? In one sense, that's kind of a strange question because it's prices go up. my money doesn't go as far. But let's
Right.
talk about. Let's try and put a little bit of a little bit more analysis into it. What is inflation?
Well, I mean, it's increasing prices, but it isn't just increasing prices on one particular product or a couple of products. Economists use what they call a market basket of goods that they think most people need to consume, which includes housing, clothing, utilities, food, all that type of stuff. And it's when you see that index as it begins to rise. Usually, consumer price index is the one I most usually see used. As that begins to rise for that market basket of goods, that's when they start talking about we have inflation. The prices are increasing for all of those, and some of them will be rising faster than others. So that's prices are rising, and typically what happens as prices begin to rise, then wages also tend to follow suit. The wages start getting higher, which is more expensive than for companies to hire labor, which means they have to thus increase their prices more in order to account for the increasing labor costs. And then the whole cycle just begins to feed on itself after a while. Yeah.
Now, so is this so-called Great Resignation that we've seen post-COVID, is that adding some fuel to the fire because we have a worker shortage? Or
I think it could be adding some to it because employers are having to spend more money to get the labor that they need. I mean, they've had to increase their labor costs. So yeah, I mean, I think that's a contribution to it. I think the single biggest thing, and again, I'm just talking as one person who watches this, but I think the single biggest thing, of course, was when we had the COVID, you want to call them lockdowns. Lockdowns is a bit extreme, but anyway, had the COVID restrictions. And then you had so much supply drive up. You had all of this demand for goods that couldn't be supplied. And so then the prices, after a while, begin to go up as people begin to come back to work and they have wages and they start getting more money again. That's where you see inflation begin to take off. Started about a year ago.
I think now you have more money and you have more demand.
Right, exactly. And then the supply then has to crank back up to meet that level of demand for goods. But so first of all, you have to get the stuff produced, and then you also have to get it transported. And if you follow the news at all, you know about all of the logistic challenges that have come from trying to get goods back and forth between countries, get them across the US because of trucker shortages. All of those things then keep the supply low relative to the demand for goods. And so inflation begins to rise. I think that is one of the biggest pushes that we've had for inflation.
Yeah.
I think a lot of economists, assuming all things had stayed relatively equal, is that probably towards the end of this year, we would have seen things begin to balance out and you would be getting back, maybe not down to 2%, but 3-4%, you could get down that range by the end of the year. But then came the Russian attack on Ukraine, which affected gas prices, and that just added more fuel on the inflation fire because gasoline became more scarce and so therefore more expensive. And gasoline figures into everything that we do.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So
I mean, the world runs on fossil fuels, doesn't it?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. So
I think
that's
also the grain. Isn't there a lot of grain that Ukraine exports that they can't?
Exactly. That's another impact, is the food impact. And so therefore food becomes much more expensive because the Ukraine, particularly for Africa and some other parts of the world, less so for the United States and the Western Hemisphere, but has been a major exporter of grain and food products. And that's largely dried up because you can't produce anything in the middle of a war. So, yeah.
Well, you sure can't, other than more machinery for war. Yeah. So what about the stimulus money that went out? Because I know when that was happening, and that was in 2020,
right?
Before the presidential election. So Donald Trump was still in
Right.
office, and I'm not saying this to lay this at his feet. I'm simply saying,
right.
And by the way, it seems to me, and maybe this is again economics is a trade-off. It seemed to me because of the COVID restrictions, the government was right to do stimulus checks. What would have happened if we hadn't, right?
Right.
So, but how much of, and then of course, I think there was a second payment Was that when Biden was in office? Did he do the second?
I can't remember if there's been 2 or 3, but yeah.
There's been 2 or 3. Maybe Trump was 2.
Yeah.
I don't recall that either.
Yeah.
But anyway, the point is the stimulus money that came because we were shut down or restricted. How much did that also add to what? Because I remember people talking about that. If we put too much money in the economy, we're going to have inflation.
Right, exactly, and that was known, and that was factored in. Is that I guess that's the thing I should emphasize is that I don't know any economists, and even the administration, Trump or Biden, who didn't expect that there was going to be inflation at the back end of this once it all transpired. That was simply part of the trade-off that you were having. And the positive side of doing that is that with the COVID restrictions, a lot of people weren't able to work. They weren't getting their salaries. And so by pumping this money into the economy, giving them stimulus, it at least put money in their pockets in the short term in order to bide them over until the economy began to recover again. And so then the tricky question became, as you continue to add stimulus to keep people solvent so that they can keep functioning, at some point, the growing number of people are also going back to work while they're also still receiving stimulus checks, which will overstimulate the economy. So at what point do you scale back the stimulus as the economy, as jobs are increasing and wages are increasing? At what point do you decrease the stimulus? So there was that trade-off of trying to figure out what that magic formula is, and there is no magic formula. I mean, it's you're trying to do your best to keep a modest thing in between. Had you just done the stimulus and not taken other actions, and then the economy returns with jobs, that's definitely inflationary. Yeah. So
okay. So then a good unemployment report, which we've been getting, three something, is also in a sense part of the problem.
Yeah,
it's good more people are working.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
But that adds
you've got 2 openings for every job.
Yeah.
So that means that companies eventually have to keep increasing wages in order to get employees, and people say, well, yay, people have been underpaid, and it's a good thing, and there's a lot of truth to that. But the upside of that is that if the wages increase, the employer eventually also has to increase the prices for the stuff that they're selling, which deflates the amount of spending power that you have with the wages you just got. So yeah, it becomes this vicious cycle.
Yeah. So that leads me, to 2 thoughts. The first is just a thought. Second's a question. I've wondered in this time of this great resignation, as I call it.
Yeah.
And it's not just people not wanting to work. I think.
Yeah.
It's Mr. McConnell says, we'll once people are done spending their stimulus money, it's like, where you been there, Senator? The stimulus money's long gone. Right.
Yeah. Right.
But, these politicians, they speak to their base who, doesn't care. But I just have wondered with this and the aging of the population in the United States, if we're just going to see certain businesses just disappear and not come back, and that we're going to see less businesses, not necessarily less in one particular industry, but just less businesses.
Yeah, I think the nature of what business has done is going to change.
Yeah,
I think that will happen. You think about, and this was a conversation for years going back before we had the COVID lockdowns, but the whole issue of automation. McDonald's going through and ordering your stuff at a kiosk, and then you only have 1 or 2 people behind the counter where you used to have 7 or 8, back there taking orders and that kind of thing. Because people don't want to work for, fast food joints. And I understand that. But it is an entry level job for low skilled workers. It often provides that good first step on the economic rung to begin to move yourself upward. But as you have a number of jobs like that I think can probably be automated, or you can redesign your operational structure where labor takes on a different role inside the company. So I don't know. We're speculating here. No one knows for sure. So I don't see a decline necessarily in the number of businesses, but I think what it is that people do is already in a state of
changing. Yeah. I have a cousin who spent her life in the hospitality industry. And she told me a couple of weekends ago that she said, you just had people through COVID and everything going on. It says, I don't want to work for this kind of pay and have to deal with demanding customers. And,
right.
I'm just tired of being abused for what I'm getting paid. I can get paid a lot more and maybe be abused. I'll be abused, but I want to get more money for it.
Right. Well, and one of the things that could change in the economic culture of our country could be that consumers learn that they have to be a little more respectful and polite of workers if they want to have good quality, service, that kind of thing. So I mean,
the customer is not always right.
I think the issue too, also with COVID, is that we had a lot of people that are stressed out, and so while the hospitality industry has always been a difficult place where you're dealing with difficult people, the level of difficulty just ratcheted up because people are stressed and frustrated already anyway. So, but as we get to the back end of this, some of this revert back to some sort of norm that we had before. My guess is probably to some major degree, but maybe not all the way back to where we were before. Yeah, that's my
2015 is not returning.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
One more question in this vein for you, and then I want to shift a little bit. Along with the profits and the inflation, and you're talking about companies having to pay more, and of course having to increase their prices to offset that.
Right.
There's a lot of criticism of corporations, and that they have they're apparently posting record profits. I haven't followed that as much. I know you have.
Right.
And so basically, the thesis is that we would not have, or at least this level of inflation, if corporations at this point weren't making record profits and being so greedy. Is that fair to some extent or not, or what do you think?
Well, I mean, with that question, so which industry are you talking about?
Well, of course. Of course, I had a person on social media because I posted something about that.
Right.
And that I didn't think we could lay this all at the feet of corporations. I don't remember where I posted it from. But somebody said, well, I agree, but they could have raised prices less, to which I said, okay, what percentage less? I mean, unless you're following this and unless you drill down, and I certainly am not doing that work, what does that mean, right? How much less? And of course, there was no response.
Sure.
I mean, anyway, what's your take?
Well, so, I mean, you look at all sorts of industries, and it's real easy to take a snapshot in time and look at corporate profits and look at inflation and say, look how terrible big corporations are. And let me preface this by saying, I'm offering no defense of large corporations here, or that they're somehow thoroughly ethical and that every decision is made with the best interests of the consumer in mind. I'm not suggesting that.
Right.
But the thesis that their higher prices because of inflation, and they're making profits, is somehow a grand conspiracy, strikes me as a bit much either. They are also looking backwards to what profits they made in the past. Some of these companies lost big money during the COVID time. And so as we are in a state of flux, trying to get back to some more balance, there's going to be a period there where they probably are going to make some pretty good profits. And they're also looking forward to what are their prospects, what's coming in the next few months, possibly taking greater profits now when they know there's going to be a severe crunch in the next few weeks or months ahead, where they're not going to be doing so well, and trying to get to a balance of things that happens over time. So it's not just the snapshot in time. I think the conversation you were talking about, I think I saw part of that conversation. We were talking about the oil prices.
It was oil in particular.
Yeah. So we're talking about oil. We've had low oil or petroleum prices for years up until COVID. Actually, just before COVID, I think they had already begun to rise. But when we had the whole COVID issue, the oil production just dropped dramatically, like by 25, 30, 35%, something like that. And oil price actually went negative briefly. In some places, we had to pay somebody to take the oil off your hands. And so what happened is that refineries and companies began to stop producing oil because there wasn't the demand for it.
Right.
And they shut down refineries because there was not enough demand to keep all those refineries running. Well, as the COVID thing began to subside and you had the economy begin to recover, now we're back up to about halfway in between where we were before COVID and where we are at the bottom of COVID. We're more than halfway up, but you can't just suddenly turn on the refineries and the drilling in a matter of a few weeks and suddenly be able to keep up with what's happening. And in fact, refineries right now are operating at near 100% capacity. Right. So you can go drill all the oil you want. If you can't get it refined and into the system, that's not going to have a right. impact on gas prices. So at one point, the oil companies lost huge amounts of money back in 2020 when everything tanked. And right now, gas has become extremely expensive because they can't get enough of it to market so quickly. So now they're making really big profits while this is happening, but that's not going to last indefinitely, right. because eventually this is going to balance out and other prices are going to have to come back and be competitive again. So it's a roller coaster for commodity companies in particular, but we could go on and look industry by industry, and I think you could look at that. But my larger point is it's complex. There are forces that are driving these things, other than just masterminds sitting in a smoke-filled room strategizing how they're going to stick people for, it's you get what I'm saying.
Yeah, getting the smuggled cigars in from Havana. Yeah. I was having a conversation with one of my sons this week who was thinking of going kind of into business for himself, doing the self-employed route. And so we were having a conversation about that. And one of the things I told him, I said, one of the things, particularly when you're self-employed, that you have to do, and of course, this is good for anybody to do.
Yeah.
But you have to save for the rainy day, so to speak. So with business, so if you have a month or 2 or 3 where business is just rocking, you need to put money away and not spend it high off the hog, because at some point you're going to have a slump.
Yep.
Right?
That's right.
This is what we're talking about what corporations do, right?
Yep.
I can remember back, maybe it was 10, 12, 13 years ago. I don't remember, but oil, I think, dropped to like $35 a barrel or something. And the oil companies were losing their shirts. And of course, what was happening was people, employees, regular Janes and Joes who were working for the energy industry were getting laid off. So this is sort of what you and I have had conversations about before, is that what happens economically is so often just a trade-off. When somebody is doing well, somebody else is hurting. And there's no way to fix that. It's just the way it works.
That's the world.
Yeah. So let's then move into the second segment here of our 3 segments.
Okay.
So it's complicated, and yet, of course, we politicians are certainly always ready to make political hay out of anything for their own benefit. I always say, if you really want to get the story in its accuracy, do not ask a politician. They're not designed to give you, politics is not, I don't know what to say. It's not designed, I don't want to say all politicians are outright liars, but they're not certainly not designed to tell the truth. It's not designed to tell the truth, because they have an election coming up, or a re-election. Yeah. So, and the other thing along with that is that it's been my opinion for a long time that the average American citizen puts too much emphasis on what the president can do. And I'm not talking about political party. I don't care whether it's Joe Biden or Donald Trump or Barack Obama or George W. Bush. Presidents can do some things, I think, certainly. But they really don't have nearly as much control. And I think a lot of times the American electorate thinks that there is this magical red button in the Oval Office that says economy, and only the presidents from their party know how to push it. And so, and whether it's President Biden, or whether it's, we want to go back and blame President Trump for the first stimulus payment, or the first 2, or whether you want to blame Congress or the oil companies, the fact of the matter is, politicizing this thing doesn't help, does it?
No. Yeah, but it's a time-honored tradition to politicize it.
It is.
going back generations and generations.
It is truly the American way.
Oh, is it ever? And fewer things just get my eyes rolling and just when I listen to politicians and presidential candidates, we created 14 million jobs and such. No, you didn't.
No.
You presided over the government while 14 million jobs were created.
Exactly.
And if 14 million jobs got created, it means you probably didn't do anything too stupid to screw it up while, companies and the economy was doing its business. So no, you didn't create those jobs.
Yeah, the only time government creates jobs is when they make more bureaucracy, right?
Yeah, exactly.
That's about it. So other than that, they really don't. Who creates jobs?
Which I want to be clear. I don't want to go to the other extreme and say that a president or a government has zero impact.
Right, exactly.
But nudging at the edges as opposed to creating the jobs. And you use the analogy of a big button. I think this is the economist friends I know almost universally. The thing I think gets under their skin so much is when people talk about the economy as though it's a thing, that it's a box or a machine, and it's got little dials on it, and that there's somebody or a handful of somebodies who are working the dials, and that's what they're the ones who are managing the economy. So if something goes bad, it's because the guy with his hands on the dials isn't dialing them right, and our guy knows how to work the dials better.
Right.
I think the better analogy, and this is not a perfect one, it's one I think about so often. In my youth, we used to go canoeing down in the Ozarks, and you get on a river, and there's some slow places in the river, and you got to paddle some. If you want to get anywhere, you got to get moving. Other times there are rapids that you got to go through, and you can't quite see where all the obstacles are in the water. But if you look ahead, you can generally see this river narrows. The water tends to come towards a V. That's where most of the water's moving, which means that's probably where there's a few obstructions. So you kind of try to steer your canoe into that V and keep your eyes out for things that may be just below the surface, and you're trying to steer around them and go around corners. That's kind of what riding the economy is like. You're trying to stay in a zone where you don't upend the canoe, you don't just get stagnant and stuck because the water's not moving. So knowing what to do in what particular circumstances, there is some of that sense of the government trying to nudge things one or the other. And if we're talking about inflation, it's really less so presidents or Congress, but the Federal Reserve Bank is the place there where they probably have more direct impact on inflation than any president or Congress is ever going to have.
Okay, so let's move. Well, let me ask you. Well, no, that's not. I was going to ask you something, but I think that's fairly irrelevant in what you said. Let me ask you. So let's talk about what role does the Federal Reserve play here?
Yeah. Well, one of the problems with when you have inflation is that you end up having the prices are rising too fast. Relative to the wages that people have. So that's typically what most people are concerned about when inflation happens. So what the Fed can do is if the economy is slowing down and people aren't buying enough, and so therefore companies are getting ready to start laying off workers and slow down production and so on, they can pump more money into the economy. That gets more money into people's hands, which gets them buying goods, which then stimulates the businesses, and then they begin producing goods and everything stays well. However, you do too much of that, and then you increase demand too much, and then prices start to rise. So you can actually increase inflation by trying to stimulate the economy. The reverse is true, is that when the economy is overheated, you decrease the amount of money supply that's in the system, which then makes money more scarce. Interest rates begin to rise. That slows down businesses' ability to expand. It decreases people's ability to buy houses. So it slows down the economy, and therefore inflation doesn't rise so quickly. So the Fed. They talk about the Fed has two things. One is to try to maintain a healthy employment rate, and also to keep low inflation. Those are the two things, and those two tend to work opposite each other. Talking about trade-offs, that's literally what the Fed's mission is to manage the trade-off between unemployment and inflation. And in the past, they talk about 1970s. I don't know how much you remember about the 1970s, but that was my childhood and junior high and high school. And boy, I sure remember the inflation of that era. And one of the readings that I think you and I had read before this we're talking about was saying that the problem there is that the Fed was probably too responsive to things. It kept trying to slow things down, speed them up, slow them down, speed them up, instead of trying to get things at a constant level and just letting small recessions happen if they need to happen, or slowdowns happen if they need to happen. And then that's what basically happened with Paul Volcker after the 1980 recession, is that he basically, somebody, I think he used the example of, it was like giving chemotherapy for cancer. It was painful. You had a bad recession because they increased the interest rates. The inflation stopped, and it was painful for a few months. And then things leveled out and stayed leveled for years and years afterwards. They didn't start moving around. I'm getting off into the weeds now, the details. But
we really haven't had. I mean, I know partisans want to take credit for the good stuff and blame the others for the bad stuff. But from Ronald Reagan through the end of Trump's presidency, we really haven't had to deal with major inflation, have we?
Not like this, nope. Yeah.
I mean, it's been steady.
Yeah.
And so that in and of itself should tell us that this is more of a complex thing. But
and I should add to that. So what happened different this time? It had nothing to do with Fed policy. It had nothing to do with government policy. It happened with something totally out of everybody's control, which was a pandemic.
Right.
And that's what disrupted the economy. And it was perceived then, and correctly so, and I think it will prove to be, this is a temporary disruption, and we will eventually get back down to something certainly in the next 2 years, possibly sooner. You'll get down to something that's closer to historically what we've known over the past generation.
Yeah, that was my next question: is what is your projection for when we're going to start to see this? So you're basically given a big window of the next 2 years.
Yeah, if you'd asked me back in January, I would have said I think we could be close to something by the end of this year, because of the wrench that the Russian aggression in Ukraine has caused. That adds another layer to it.
Yeah,
I still think next year, and it's very reasonable to think that we would be down to something that's getting closer to what we knew historically.
Isn't part of this too that the markets and I don't want to make markets impersonal, but people, all of us, over time we just adjust, don't we?
Yes, right.
I mean, at one point when gas was $2 a gallon, we were all up in arms over it and everything. But then, if gas would go to 2 gallons in the next 3 months, we'd all be extremely happy.
Right.
So we just tend to adjust as well to the changes.
Sure. Oh, and I think the challenge is, and that's what's challenging for inflation, and what can be dangerous about prolonged inflation, is that as prices keep going up, eventually consumers begin to factor in that prices are going to keep going up. Mm-hmm. So they start trying to buy stuff sooner now before it gets too expensive. And meanwhile, they're expecting higher and higher wages because that's what they're going to need to survive. And so if they keep doing those two things, it also puts businesses in the point of they have to keep increasing the prices because they got to pay for the wages, and the demand's increasing in the current. So it ends up being this vicious circle. And so you want to get inflation back low and get people's expectations that inflation is going to stay low in order to have a more stable economy.
But even with all of that, economies go in cycles, don't they? I mean, at some point, we call them recessions. Obviously, we don't want a depression, but we have recessions, and then we have a boom in the economy and everything.
Sure.
Is some of this, in a sense, because we'll always sometimes we talk about the stock market doing an adjustment, right?
Yeah.
It gets too inflated, so it makes an adjustment. Is a recession, and no one likes to go through a recession. It's not fun, but is it in some ways an adjustment? Is it in some ways recession saying, okay, things are going too quickly, too much going on, we got to back up a little bit?
Yeah, that's my estimation. It's part of the great circle of life. Yeah,
great circle of life. I sense a song coming on, Michael.
Yeah.
And by the way, you sure don't want to be a president during one of those. I mean,
no, exactly.
I mean, whether it's fair or not, we do blame the president, or we give the president credit.
We blame the president, we give him credit, and the president takes credit.
Absolutely. The president is not going to say, "Oh, it really wasn't me."
Yeah, right.
But we do that, and that's just the reality of our politics. But at least we're doing our little part in our little corner of the room to try and correct the record a little bit.
Right. Well, so I just feedback to what you were saying there, though. It's yes, there is a boom and bust element of things. The Fed tries to manage the bumpiness.
Yeah.
It can't stop a fluctuation in the economy. Like I said, it's not a machine that's somebody's got their hand on a dial, but you can try to provide some buffers at the extremes.
Try to make it ride a little less rough.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I think that's what most politicians and the Fed generally is trying to do, is to try to keep something stable.
Yeah. Okay, good. I like it. Well, let's move into our final segment. As we always do, we say, as followers of Jesus, what is important for us when we think about this, when people's prices are rising? Michael, I don't like paying what I'm paying for gas, but my wife and I are to the place, and I'm newly retired. We can afford it. We really can. It's not. I would rather not pay it, but I'm okay. I mean, I'm putting food we're putting food on the table and all of that. So, we're doing okay. But, there are families that are really struggling right now. Families that were living hand to mouth. You talk about those low wage laborers. And as a pastor for a long time, I dealt with people, 2-income families.
Right.
Were we call them unskilled workers. I don't know if I like that term, but that's the term we use.
Right.
Who are working hard, but are one financial disaster away from a mess.
Yeah.
And so, as a Christian, I need to think about that. I need to think about my responsibility to my neighbor.
Right.
And I'm not talking about those Christians who are, really struggling, but for those of us who aren't, what can we do to take account and help our neighbors who through this rough spot in which, and of course, inflation, we know, and has been said time and time again, is one of the worst, I'm going to use the word in parentheses, one of the worst taxes you can inflict upon the poor.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
So how do I love my neighbor as a follower of Jesus in this? I who have some means and who actually can do it.
Yeah. You're a pastor. You worked in a church with congregants and so on. What things have you seen?
Well, I think one of the things that I would do is, in church, I've had in every church I've served, and I don't know if all churches have this, but we did have a crisis fund. And what I would simply do, one of the things I would do is I would appeal to my congregation and say, hey, those of us who are in financial position that we can do so, even though we're all paying higher prices, we need to bolster this crisis fund.
Yeah.
Because there are people who are working hard,
right.
But they just don't have access to the resources the rest of us do. And so it's time for us this time to step forward and put more in, so that we can assist more people who perhaps in the past, for example, pretty much could make their rent every month, but now, with trying to feed the kids, maybe that's tough, right?
Yeah.
So that would be one thing I would recommend.
Yeah, certainly. Yeah. And I think that's part of the issue of churches and voluntary organizations that have that close relationship with people in their community, where they can see the individual circumstances.
Yes.
Which a large government policy is never going to be able to fully address. That's where, and that personal touch, I think also, definitely the financial, obviously, I'm not dismissing that to say this, but also just the personal support of people that are stressed and in a crisis situation, being able to provide that emotional and personal support as well as the necessary financial support. I think that's one place one of the places that churches can help. I think that, and going back to some of the macro things for a second here, just a couple I think of. I am generally not thrilled about the idea of the government issuing stimulus checks or trying to manage the economy through just pumping out money and putting in people's hands. In fact, I'm almost viscerally opposed to it under most circumstances. In this case, I was totally in support of it.
Yeah.
And I think it was exactly the right thing to do. I would have, I understand why it's complicated, but I think I would hope to have tailored it more towards the bottom end of the income spectrum rather than just giving everybody a stimulus. And I can debate you the theories one way or the other as to why that is. That would have been my preference to go that direction. But the idea of stimulus checks was a good thing. So the question then becomes, as a Christian, are you thinking about the good of others, or are you totally locked in to a rigid ideological position that can't see that there's times where you need to adjust for specific circumstances? So having a theology that allows you to be able to think in those terms.
Yeah.
I think one of the other issues that I would add is with healthcare. If we had a healthcare system that was accessible to everybody, where everybody had basic access to health, it would decrease the stress considerably for a lot of people, poor people in our economy, who are afraid of losing healthcare because of what's happening with COVID. And so I think, and I'm not necessarily talking about a Bernie Sanders socialized healthcare system, but just there are other ways to get at that that make sure that everybody has a minimal level of healthcare.
Well, other countries in Europe have demonstrated you don't have to have a single payer system to make this to get what you're talking about. Of course, again, we always put everything in either or. Either you've got a laissez-faire system or you've got socialized medicine. And that's another political talking point. But I do think, I have, again, as a pastor, worked with people who don't have health care and, have symptoms, and they're afraid to go to the doctor because they can't cover it,
Right.
And, this shouldn't happen. This should, so I'm with you on those two things very much so.
Yeah.
And I do, I do think, it's interesting. I did have a lot of conversations with people who got the stimulus checks who didn't need it, and how many of us gave it away, gave it to either children who were not as well established, or who weren't working, or saw another need and gave it because we said, we don't need this.
Right.
And so people did do that, but I agree with you. It would have been nice if we could have targeted it a little more. But government, they target anything they can do for their reelection. So I know I'm sounding cynical this morning, but when it comes to politics,
it's not hard.
It's not hard. So anyway.
Those I just think of a couple of things like that, and that goes actually back to the point we're talking about in terms of stabilizing people's lives.
Yeah.
And in a time where the economy is prosperous and we're not having inflation and we're not having these issues, you can muddle along with an inadequate healthcare system and inadequate support for people, but particularly in these times where the economy swings out of control for whatever reason, they are the most vulnerable. And that's where I come to the idea that if you had a universal healthcare, not necessarily socialized medicine, but you had universal healthcare, that would take some of the sting off of the dips in the economy when it occurs. Doing a stimulus check when there's a radical disruption in the economy, those things seem to be at the macro level the kind of things that Christians should be supportive of and should be advancing. But even with all of that, and I think that gets to the point of the church, voluntary organizations, nothing trumps the ability of knowing people personally and knowing their circumstances and being able to tailor specifically to that person's specific needs. And I think that's where most churches need to focus.
Yeah, I would say that one of the problems, we talk about the decline of the church in America, and like the economy, there's no one reason for that. But I would say one important reason has been that a lot of churches have over the years lost touch with their communities.
Right.
When I say community, I don't mean like their town. I mean like the neighborhood that surrounds them. And and you can see this when over time, nobody from the church, nobody who attends the church is from that neighborhood.
Right.
And at some point, the communities began to change, but the church continued and its own kind of thing. And that has now there are certainly, and what we're finding is now the communities that are now starting, the smaller church communities that are starting, are in touch with their neighborhoods.
Right.
And they're, and they're growing, maybe not exploding, but they're attracting people. And so until we see that and saying there's no substitute for reaching out in the community and knowing people, and then adjusting and offering things accordingly, it's it's my continued belief that federalism is a good thing, that local communities know what's best for them.
Yeah.
And I mourn the fact that neither political party believes in federalism anymore.
Exactly. Yeah. They believe in what gets them elected. That's what
and so just to say that, and so if the church can't know its community and know what helps it if they're not there involved. Yeah.
I'll just bring up one example of a church that I've been associated with that I thought had a fairly novel approach to how they would address issues. They became interested in the plight, and this is in a suburban neighborhood, by the way, but the plight of poor children in their suburban school system, and often the humiliation and the issues that they deal with being a poverty person in a high school or a junior high school of affluence. And so one of the things that the church did was they established a relationship with the school social worker. Each of the schools have a social worker. And so they talked to the social worker and they said, what is it that your kids need, that you need, in order to help meet needs that the children have at school? And to give one example, things that you would never know unless you talk with somebody who's involved with people that are in these situations. A lot of these kids may only have 2 or 3 pairs of clothes to come to school in, or they may have a home life that's so dysfunctional that they don't have parents that will wash their clothes and get them ready for school. Yeah. So one of the things that the school did was they asked for a washer and dryer to have at school. The kids could discreetly bring their dirty clothes to school and drop them off, and then pick them up at the end of the day and take home clean clothes so that they could come to school clean like the other kids, and nobody would know it. They had ways of discreetly preparing little backpacks of food for them to take home, because they were not getting enough to eat at home without any of the kids knowing that they were taking food home from the school. Yeah. Then working out that system. Now, the issue that becomes the challenge for the church is that we so much want to do projects where we can go and personally be involved and get the great joys and warm fuzzies about interacting with people and seeing ourselves as helpers, and that kind. Often that's not what's needed. And so the question is, are you really going to do the serious hard work of focusing your energies to what people need rather than what's going to make you feel good? Yeah. And I think that becomes something else to look at in these times where people are struggling. Jesus says, "Don't let your left hand know what your right hand is doing." And we want the joy of seeing how it helps, or we also want the kudos for doing it. And exactly, I agree. I think we should be more like Jesus. Do what you do because you do it, and don't worry about that. So wow. Anything else we should say here before we close in reference to inflation? I feel like we've had pretty good productive discussion there. We covered a range of stuff. Yeah. So good. Well, we can end that. So Michael, thank you again. Yeah. For, as always, very good conversation. And thank you. Friends, we're grateful that you joined us. This is Faith Seeking Understanding. I am Allan Bevere, and the patron saint of Faith Seeking Understanding is Anselm of Canterbury, who said, "I do not seek to understand that I may believe, but I believe in order to understand." So friends,
I hope you keep seeking. Take care.
Bye.